We have a rather esoteric subject this morning, the awakening of Kundalini. To understand the Kundalini, we ought to consider it in the broader context of the foundation of creation itself, which is duality. All things were created out of the one consciousness of God. I've often mentioned that this is the real basis for the Jewish saying, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one." That it isn't only, as has been thought, that we don't want to worship idols, but that we want to understand that all duality is merely a veil cast over the single reality of God. There is only God. There is only that one essence. And then when God manifested himself outward into creation, he took on the appearance of duality. He moved his consciousness, and moving his consciousness, it was not possible to move it only in one direction. Because in fact there is no direction anyway. Thinking in one way, it had to be compensated for by thought in the opposite direction. That it's sort of like the level of the ocean, which never changes. You can't change the ocean by creating great waves. And any movement of the ocean in an upward direction, because the reality is in the center, has to be compensated for by a movement in the opposite direction. For every wave, there has to be a trough. So this is essential to the very structure of the universe, that because the reality of the universe is in the center, in God, and there isn't any other reality, therefore any movement of appearance in one way must be compensated for by a movement and appearance in the other way, to bring everything back to a state of equilibrium in the center, which is the sole reality. Now, in creation we find this movement going on all the time. There is the movement toward heat and then cold, light and darkness, pleasure and pain, and so on. But there's another kind of movement too, and that is the very movement of consciousness in the first place. We can use another illustration here, where sending something out from the initial consciousness of the spirit, moving outward from that center, that's the movement to which there have to be all these things. But the very start of that storm represents a generative impulse on the part of spirit, the wish to create, to manifest itself. And that, too, can be talked of as a pole opposite to the state of rest in the center. See, we're talking of the duality of Maya in the first place, which is the expression of Maya in this dual state, that in the state of Maya, everything has its opposite. But there is also the initial impulse, to which the only opposite is directional. The impulse from calmness into restlessness, from centeredness into outward manifestation, from detachment into involvement. And this impulse that pushes everything away from the spirit, you can't say that the spirit is opposite to it. That would be legitimate poetically, but if you really want to be philosophical about it, it can't have an opposite, because it's the only reality. There can't be an opposite to it. So the only opposition we can speak of here is an opposition of direction. That when there's a direction outward, there must also be a pull inward. And this kind of oppositional state is what we're really referring to when we speak of Kundalini. Kundalini represents that, well, remember that thing in that little episode in the path where I mentioned the time that Master said to me, what keeps the earth from being merged back into the sun, being drawn back into the sun? Why isn't it drawn back into the sun? And I thought he was asking for a lesson in astronomy. I didn't know. It took a while for me to understand. He was really talking to me and talking allegorically to help me understand the relationship between the soul and God. So I said, well, sir, that's its centrifugal force, that makes it keep wanting to pull away from the sun. And then he said, well, then why doesn't it leave the sun? And I said, that's because the sun is pulling on it. And so we have the duality of direction, the direction of God's love pulling everything back into himself, the direction of creation itself, which is a push outward away from him. Now, many people think that Satan is a purely mental concept. But in fact, what Satan is purely this outward pushing energy from the Spirit. It's an energy that, well, you've all probably experienced being very tired, in fact, being so tired that you couldn't stop working. It was easier to keep on working than it was to put the brakes on and go to bed. This kind of thing, we find that when we get going in a particular direction, the energy takes over and keeps wants to keep going that way. Well, the satanic force is, in a sense, you could put it in a very real sense that way, that the energy coming out from the Spirit gets its own momentum, and then it begins to want to keep going, and it resists anything that will draw it back into the heart of the Spirit.